The memo arrived on a Tuesday, which Warrant Officer Raymond Acaffer would later think was appropriate. Nothing good ever came on a Tuesday. It was printed on Ministry of Defense letterhead, which meant someone had gone to the trouble of making it official before anyone had a chance to object. The subject line read, Ceremonial Dress Modernization Review Phase 3 Consultation, Bearskin Cap, Canadian Black Bear, Ursus Americanus. Beneath that, in smaller font, as if the author understood the absurdity and had decided to lean into it, Cost-Benefit Analysis and Synthetic Alternative Assessment, Response required within 21 days. Acaffer read it once standing at his desk. Then he sat down and read it again. Then he placed it face down on the blotter and looked out the window at the parade ground, where a section of guardsmen were running drill in the early morning gray, their bearskins rising and falling with each step like dark crowns that had decided to go for a march on their own. 24 years. He had worn the uniform of the Coldstream Guards for 24 years. He had worn the bearskin at 3 Trooping the Color ceremonies, at 2 state funerals, at the coronation of one monarch, and at the wedding of another. He had stood outside Buckingham Palace in temperatures that dropped to -8 and outside Horse Guards in heat that climbed past 32 degrees, perfectly still, perfectly upright, the bearskin sitting on his head like a declaration. He had never once thought of it as a hat. He turned the memo back over, picked up a pen, and wrote one word in the margin beside the response deadline. Noted. Then he picked up the phone. Dr. Gillian Marsh arrived at Wellington Barracks on a Thursday morning with a Ministry of Defense lanyard, a slim laptop bag, and the particular energy of someone who had already decided what the answer was and was here as a courtesy to let you know. She was not unpleasant. That was the first thing Acaffer noticed. He had been prepared for unpleasant. Unpleasant he knew how to handle. She was something considerably more difficult. She was reasonable. Warrant Officer Acaffer. She shook his hand with the confidence of someone who had shaken a great many important hands and found them all roughly equivalent. Thank you for agreeing to meet. I want to be clear from the outset that this is a consultation, not a decision. Nothing has been determined. I appreciate that, Dr. Marsh. Good. She set her laptop on the table in the briefing room and opened it with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom time was a resource being actively managed. I've prepared a summary of the review's current findings. 17 slides. I'll try to get through them in under 40 minutes so we have time for questions. She was through the first 3 slides before Acaffer said anything. The numbers were not wrong. That was the problem. £1,700 per cap at current procurement rates. A replacement cycle of approximately 15 years under ideal conditions, shorter with heavy ceremonial use. The synthetic alternative, a compound fiber developed by a manufacturer in the Midlands, was visually indistinguishable from genuine bearskin at distances greater than 40 meters. It cost £260 per unit. It was waterproof, UV-resistant, and required no specialist storage. The animal welfare dimension, Marsh continued, advancing to slide 7, has become increasingly significant in terms of public perception. We've seen a 31% increase in media coverage linking the bearskin procurement to Canadian bear culling operations since 2019. The reputational cost is difficult to quantify precisely, but our modeling suggests. Dr. Marsh, Acaffer said it quietly the way he said most things, can I ask you something? She looked up from the laptop. Of course. Have you ever watched a guardsman receive his bearskin for the first time? A brief pause, the kind that meant the question had not appeared in her preparation materials. I haven't, no, but I've reviewed the ceremonial documentation extensively and I'd like to show you something before we continue with the slides, if that's all right. She checked her watch. She had other meetings. She was, as she had established, a person for whom time was a managed resource. But something in the way Acaffer stood up, not urgently, not dramatically, simply as if the next part of the conversation was going to happen on his terms and the room could decide whether to come along, made her close the laptop. "Lead the way," she said. The ceremonial stores at Wellington Barracks smelled of lanolin and leather, and something older than both. A smell that had no precise name, but that Akaffer had long ago decided was what permanence smelled like. The rows of bearskins sat on their individual stands in the controlled temperature storage room, each one tagged with a guardsman's name and service number. Each one shaped slightly differently because no two heads were the same shape, and the bearskins, over years of wear, conformed to the person beneath them. "Each cap is individually fitted," Akaffer said, moving slowly along the row. "Takes about 3 fittings to get right. The lining is adjusted by hand. The chin strap is set to the exact tension required for that guardsman's jaw structure. At a tension in wind, in rain, in crowd conditions, the fit has to be precise enough that the cap doesn't shift. A shifting cap at the cenotaph is not acceptable." Marsh was taking notes on her phone. He didn't mind. Notes were fine. Notes meant she was still listening. "The synthetic alternative," she said, not unkindly, "would be fitted using the same process, wouldn't it? The individualization isn't unique to the natural material." "No," Akaffer agreed, "it isn't." He stopped in front of a stand near the end of the row. The bearskin on it was newer than the others, the fur still carrying a depth of color that years of wear would eventually soften. The tag read, "Guardsman T. Brennan, joined 2023. "Brennan gets his first issue next week," Akaffer said. "He's been in the regiment 8 months. Good soldier. Bit nervous at drill, but he steadies under pressure. You'd want him next to you." Marsh looked at the bearskin. Something in her expression shifted, not much, just enough to notice. "He hasn't worn it yet." "Not on duty. He's tried it on during fitting. But first duty issue is a ceremony in itself." Akaffer paused. "Not an official ceremony, nothing in the regs, just something the regiment does. The senior warrant officer presents it, says a few words. It takes about 3 minutes." "What kind of words?" Akaffer was quiet for a moment. The kind that don't translate well into a briefing document. He moved toward the door. She followed. In the corridor outside the stores, they passed a glass case mounted on the wall, not large, not prominently placed. Easy to walk past if you weren't looking. Inside it, a single bearskin, older than anything in the storage room, the fur worn thin in places, the leather interior darkened with decades of contact. Marsh stopped. "That one isn't in rotation," she said. It wasn't a question. The case had a brass plate beneath it. Akaffer stopped beside her and read the plate aloud, though he knew every word of it without looking. "Sergeant David Kowalski, Coldstream Guards, 1948–1982, worn at the Falkland Islands, June 1982. Returned to barracks by his section, who carried it home when they could not carry him." The corridor was very quiet. "They carried the bearskin back," Marsh said. "Yes." "From the Falklands?" "Yes." She looked at the case for another few seconds. Then she straightened her lanyard and said, "We should get back to the briefing room," in a voice that was still professional, but was doing a little more work than it had been 20 minutes ago. The conference room was the kind of room that had hosted 1,000 arguments and remembered none of them. Institutional carpet, a table that had been modernized once in the 90s and then left alone, a window that looked out onto a section of the barracks wall where a guardsman was currently standing post with the particular quality of stillness that took years to learn. Marsh reopened her laptop. Akaffer sat across from her with nothing in front of him, no documents, no counter-presentation, no notes. Just his hands flat on the table and the patience of a man who had stood motionless for 6-hour ceremonial duties in February. "I want to acknowledge," Marsh began, and her voice was slightly different now, careful in a way it hadn't been that morning, "that what I saw in the stores is genuinely meaningful. I'm not here to dismiss that. The institutional memory, the individual connection, these are real things. They are, Akhefer said. But they are also things that could be preserved through other means. A retired cap in a display case remains meaningful regardless of what the active issue is made from. The symbol doesn't require the material to be authentic. Akhefer looked at her steadily. Tell me more about that. The public standing at the barriers at Horse Guards cannot tell the difference between a genuine bearskin and a high-quality synthetic at the distances involved. The visual continuity of the ceremony is preserved. The cultural resonance is preserved. The animal welfare concern is addressed. The procurement cost is reduced by approximately 85% over a 10-year horizon. She turned the laptop to face him. A graph, clean lines projecting downward. The savings could be redirected to operational equipment, to veteran support programs, to any number of things the regiment actually needs. The public can't tell the difference, Akhefer said. No, not at 40 meters. Can the guardsmen tell the difference? A pause. That's the question of internal experience versus external presentation is. It's not a complicated question, Dr. Marsh. She closed the laptop halfway, which was as close as she came to conceding a point. The guardsmen would know. Yes. And you're telling me that matters. I'm telling you, Akhefer said, that the uniform is not a costume. It's not worn for the people at the barriers. It is worn because of what it means to the person inside it. The moment you optimize it for the observers and not the wearer, you've changed what it is. You've changed it into a costume, and you can't change it back. Marsh sat back. Outside the window, the guardsmen at post hadn't moved. The synthetic alternative would still be a uniform, she said, but it came out with less certainty than the slides had carried. It would be a replica of a uniform, Akhefer said. That is not the same thing. She pushed back. She was good at this. She hadn't reached a senior advisory position by abandoning a position when someone looked at her steadily. She came back to the cost data, the welfare angle, the modernization imperative, the international perception. She made her case with the precision of someone who had made it many times before and found it generally persuasive. Akhefer answered each point the same way, not dismissively, not with speeches, just with the specific, particular human detail that the slide couldn't hold. The welfare argument. These caps come from the Canadian government's regulated black bear cull, bears that are culled regardless of the contract. The contract determines whether the hides are used or discarded. The cost argument. £1,700 over 15 years is less than the cost of one administrative consultation cycle, including travel and accommodation. The perception argument. In 2012, the regiment surveyed veterans going back to 1960. Every single one of them named the bearskin as the single item of kit they would not surrender. Not the tunic, not the boots, the bearskin. The stalemate arrived around 11:30. Neither of them had raised their voice. Neither had surrendered a position. The room had the careful, exhausted quality of a conversation that had been entirely honest and had arrived nowhere. Marsh closed her laptop fully. I appreciate your candor, warrant officer. I genuinely do. But the review will need a formal response, and personal conviction, however well argued, isn't going to be sufficient to halt a ministry-level process. She began to gather her papers. I'd encourage you to submit a written statement. It will be considered. Akhefer nodded. He said nothing because there was nothing left to say in the language she was working in. That was when the door opened. General, retired, Hugh Ferreira did not announce himself. He was in his 70s, wearing a civilian suit that had been made for him sometime in the previous decade and still fit, because he had refused to change shape for anyone's convenience. He was not tall. He gave the impression of height through some quality of posture that Akhefer recognized immediately as the same thing he'd spent 24 years trying to maintain himself. He nodded at Akhefer. He looked at Marsh with the assessment of a man who had spent 40 years evaluating people in the first 3 seconds and had found the skill generally reliable. "Dr. Marsh," he said, "not a question." She stood slightly straighter without appearing to mean to. "General Ferreira, I wasn't informed you'd be attending." "No," he agreed and sat down. He placed a manila envelope on the table in front of him. It was old, not damaged, but aged, the kind of old that meant it had been handled carefully for a long time. "I heard the review had reached consultation stage. I thought I'd come down." "With respect, General, the consultation has concluded for today and—" "I have a letter," he said. "It'll take 4 minutes, then I'll leave you to it." He opened the envelope with the care of a man who understood that some objects required a certain quality of attention. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten. The ink faded to the particular brown that blue ink becomes after 40 years. He unfolded it on the table, smoothed it once with his palm, and looked at it for a moment before he looked up. "Margaret Kowalski," he said, "David Kowalski's wife. She wrote this in October 1982, 4 months after the Falklands. She sent it to the regiment." He paused. "She sent it because of the bearskin." The room was very still. He read. Not all of it. 4 sentences, as he had promised approximately 4 minutes worth, but the kind of 4 sentences that don't leave a room the same way they enter it. "They brought his cap home. I didn't understand at first why that mattered so much to me. It's only a hat, I told myself. It's only a thing, and David is gone, and a thing cannot change that. But I've had it 4 months now, and I think I understand. When his friends carried it home, they were saying, 'He was here, he stood here in this, and that is not nothing. That is not nothing at all.'" Ferreira folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. He placed the envelope in the center of the table, equidistant between himself and Marsh, as if it were evidence being submitted and both parties had equal right to examine it. He said, "The review can recommend whatever it likes. That's its function. But before it does, I thought whoever was writing the recommendation should know what the bearskin is for. Not ceremonially, not historically." He stood, practically. He nodded at Akeffer again. He left. The door closed with the quiet click of something that had made its point, without requiring a dramatic exit. The conference room held the silence for longer than was comfortable. Marsh sat with her hands in her lap, her laptop closed, her papers organized but untouched. She was looking at the envelope in the center of the table. She did not reach for it. She didn't need to. She had heard every word. Akeffer waited. He was good at waiting. "I need to note for the record," Marsh said finally, her voice measured and careful in the way it gets when someone is choosing words not for the room, but for the document they'll write afterwards, that the general's visit was not part of the scheduled consultation process. "No," Akeffer said, "it wasn't. And that anecdotal evidence, however compelling, does not constitute formal grounds for a policy suspension." "I know." She gathered her papers into her bag with the deliberate precision of someone who was using the physical task to give herself a moment inside her own head. Akeffer watched this and recognized it. He had seen soldiers do the same thing after operations. Methodical small actions performed carefully when the larger things were too big to hold all at once. "The recommendation," she said, without looking up from her bag, "will reflect that the consultation process identified significant institutional and cultural considerations that require further evaluation before any material change is implemented." She snapped the bag closed. "Which means the review is suspended pending additional assessment." "How long?" Akeffer asked. She looked up. Something in her expression had shifted in a way that her expression probably didn't shift very often in professional settings. Not defeat, not conversion, something quieter than either. "Long enough," she said. Akeffer stood. "I'll walk you out." They went through the barracks in silence, through the corridor with the glass case, past the stores, along the ground floor passage that opened onto the parade ground. The morning had moved into early afternoon while they'd been arguing. The light had changed, gone from gray to a thin winter gold that did something particular to the parade ground, made it look briefly like something from a painting rather than a working military installation. At the gate, Marsh stopped. On the pavement outside, the street was doing what London streets do at midday, moving, constant, indifferent. But across the road, where Horse Guards Parade opened into its long ceremonial expanse, a section of the public had gathered along the barriers. Tourists mostly, cameras raised. And beyond the barriers, the household cavalry were at post. Horses still. Guardsmen still. The bearskins from this distance, from the pavement, from 40 meters, exactly what they had always been. Marsh stood at the gate and watched. Akeffer stood slightly behind her and watched her watch. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the scene wasn't already saying. A small child near the barrier had pressed her face between the railings and was staring up at the nearest guardsman with the total absorption of someone encountering something they had no category for yet. The guardsman did not move, did not look down, did not acknowledge the child or the tourists or the cameras or the entire daily human circus of people pressing against the barriers to see him. He simply stood, in his bearskin, in the particular quality of stillness that takes years to learn and cannot be synthesized. Marsh watched for perhaps 2 minutes. Then she adjusted the strap of her laptop bag, said, "Thank you for your time, warrant officer," and walked away into the city without looking back. Akeffer watched her go until she turned the corner. Then he turned back toward the barracks and walked with the same unhurried steadiness he always walked with, past the parade ground, past the stores, past the glass case in the corridor where Sergeant David Kowalski's bearskin sat on its stand in the particular quality of light that the case had been positioned to catch. Its fur worn thin in the places where a human head had rested for 34 years of service, before it was carried home across 8,000 miles of ocean by men who understood what it meant without being able to say exactly why. Akeffer stopped at the case. He stood in front of it for a moment the way he always did when he passed, not long, not ceremonially, just long enough. Then he went back to his desk, picked up the memo that was still sitting face down on the blotter, turned it over, and placed it in the file marked "Resolved, no action required." He had not saved anything spectacular. He had not prevented a crime or exposed a deception or uncovered something that would change the course of history. He had sat in a room and answered questions carefully, and walked a woman through a corridor, and let a retired general read 4 sentences aloud, and watched a child press her face against a barrier railing. And Sergeant Kowalski's bearskin was still in its case. And Guardsman Brennan's bearskin was still on its stand in the stores, waiting for next week's fitting ceremony, waiting for the 3 minutes of words that didn't translate into briefing documents. And outside at Horse Guards, the guardsman was still at post. Still, the way some things simply are, not because anyone has made a compelling business case for their continuation, but because they are true, and truth, it turns out, is surprisingly difficult to file a recommendation against. Akeffer straightened the blotter, capped his pen, and looked out the window at the parade ground. Somewhere in the city, he supposed, Dr. Gillian Marsh was writing a suspension recommendation in language precise enough to satisfy a ministry committee and vague enough to mean not yet, and perhaps not ever. And I am not entirely sure I can explain why, except that I stood at a gate this afternoon and watched a child look at a man in a bearskin, and I think I am still thinking about it. He didn't know that for certain, but he thought it was probably true.